I grew up in the 50s and 60s. If you watch Mad Men or Masters of Sex or Boardwalk Empire, you get a glimpse of what the place for women was then. From the home to the workplace, women were not expected or encouraged to equal, let alone surpass men. For example, unlike my daughters, when I graduated high school, I had no one advising me about careers, college majors, or colleges for that matter. I applied to Yale, which did not accept women in 1963. Fortunately, on all counts, that is not the case today. How did we get from the attitudes 50 years ago to those of today? For generations, even our language placed women as a subset of men. Interestingly enough, there are many more derogatory words for woman than for man. Then there are the entirely and unnecessarily male-centric words like man-made, manufacture, manpower, chairman, human, and history. These words, along with the lower expectations of the second sex, entered the consciousness of both men and women generations ago and lounged there until a small group of women began to make big waves. Gloria Steinem was and is a major leader in that effort to raise the consciousness of everyone regarding the potential and the equality of women in the world. In doing that, she has been a central influence in the women's movement, Planned Parenthood, Ms. Foundation, Ms. Magazine, Take Our Daughters to Work Day, Equal Rights Amendment, feminism, racism, women in sports, sisterhood, bra burning, parenting, abortion, the death penalty, child abuse, women in politics, women's education, multiracial education, all done in the United States and around the world. Well, I do not doubt that 50 years ago, this luncheon, this amazing initiative conceived and created and funded by women for women, could never have been imagined, let alone executed. There is still work to be done. One disturbing statistic in the United States is that women earn just 80% of what men make for full-time work. In addition, mothers earn 5% less per hour per child than comparable working women who are childless. The equality of women still needs to be addressed, and Gloria Steinem is ardently doing it around the world today. Piles of books have been written by Gloria Steinem and about her. She has awards and magazines and organizations in her name. She is about to be one of the 2013 recipients of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. That is the nation's highest civilian honor in peacetime, and it doesn't get much bigger than that. She has become an icon. She is one for the history books. It is my enormous honor to welcome her to our podium.
Is this a room full of energy and rebellion and I can feel it. I have a deep suspicion that I am an excuse for you to come together and discover that you didn't need me in the first place. You have all the energy you need right here. And already I'm sitting there thinking, well, we could continue to change language. Suppose men had to graduate with a Spinster of Arts degree and a mistress of science and worked hard for a sistership. You know, you might feel left out too. So no, we are not trying to leave anybody out, right? We are trying to be inclusive and to show the truth, which is that the individual difference is bigger than the group difference. The unique human being each of us is the result of millennia upon millennia of heredity and environment joined in a way that could never have happened before and could never happen again. I never liked the nature versus nurture argument, did you? Because obviously it's both. And we are both unique and part of the human family. So what we are striving for in so many ways, I think, is to understand once again that we are linked, not ranked. Whether we are women or men, whatever our ethnic, racial, cultural, geographic background, we are truly linked, not ranked. And I am so glad to be here on a women-to-women occasion, because to me, this kind of organization is the symbol of that unity. It's a great proof, for one thing, that the women's movement and feminism has always been as concerned with equality among women as with equality between males and females. And it's also proof that lasting change grows from the bottom up, like a tree. One of the ways we are kept quiet is to convince us that change only comes from the top. And that is absolutely not the case. And the inspiration for your activism and your funding shows that that is not the case. I think that those who benefit from inequality are still trying to convince us that it comes from the top down, but it really doesn't. Actually, it's not true. Even after we've elected someone to a top office, we still have to pay attention to them, right? We can't depend on them to be the only force. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, once said to someone who came in to lobby him, "Okay, you've convinced me, now go out and force me to do it." We have to stay organized. And by the evidence of gridlock in Washington, we have to understand that perhaps we've paid too much attention to the top, to Congress, and not state by state in each legislature where who is in Congress is determined. Most Americans don't know who their state legislators are. And that neglect is exactly what has produced this situation in which a few organized groups that don't represent the majority of Republicans or Democrats have been able to elect extremists, and we are paying the price. So I hope each of us, in whatever way we can, whether it has to do with local funding or it has to do with, what we could do today, we could divide up your state legislature. Each one of us could take as an assignment one member and monitor that person from this day forward. How about that? So they don't redistrict themselves into perpetuity. I hear little mumbles here with the this is only a hint of why we are all part of what is called the longest revolution. It's the longest because we are half of everything, half of every group and every continent. It's the longest revolution because you cannot continue the systems of race or class or caste without controlling women, without controlling reproduction. Otherwise, those racist lines cannot remain clear. Certainly we should understand that in this country, where those two caste systems have been so clearly intertwined, and because we are the most basic means of production, the means of reproduction. And we forget sometimes as we talk about production that reproduction is actually more important. And all of our dictatorial systems have at some point to control reproduction, which means controlling women's bodies. So in fact, this is going to be, I don't know how to break this to you, a very long revolution. But I think to say an unusual but I think encouraging word, we need to remember that the land where we are now once knew and sometimes still does know cultures that were modeled on a circle, not a hierarchy. Before Europeans showed up, there were languages, for instance, the Cherokee language, including the Eastern Band that was here, is here, that didn't have he or she in the language. And yet we have got collectively so crazy that we now attribute gender to tables and chairs in some languages. How did that happen? Because the gender roles were invented to control reproduction. Thus, masculinity was dominant and femininity was subordinate. It doesn't need to be that way. We're just discovering the past, and that the various tribes of the Iroquois Confederacy, that those women, well, the tribes inspired our Constitution. I think we're beginning to understand that. But those women inspired the suffrage movement, because there were no reservations then, and the European American women could see these women next door going to the same country stores who lived in a completely different way, who controlled their own fertility, who decided how many children and when to bear children, where female elders had just as much power as male elders. And at the same time, the Native American women were looking at the European American women and were appalled. They called them those who die in childbirth because they were so shocked at the way, the hierarchy, the way that women were treated. So I say this only because I think if we understand what existed for 95% of human history, not just on this continent, but also in Latin America, also the Kwe and the San in Africa, from whom we all came, every one of us, also the Dalits in India, that those cultures were modeled on the circle, not a pyramid, that they didn't have the dominant masculine and submissive feminine role until over long periods of time there came to be systems that controlled women as the means of reproduction. I say that to you because I think the way we are most discouraged is to be told it's human nature. You know, there has always been this gender division, there has always been racism, there has always been war in which people who had no stake whatsoever in the outcome of the war were encouraged to risk their lives. It's not true. It hasn't always been this way. It's only the last 5% of human history, and on this subcontinent, only 500 or 600 years. So I think today, perhaps we should just declare, patriarchy, racism, nationalism, because lines in the sand are artificial too, and they're now disappearing, right? Monotheism, sorry, but if God looks like the ruling class, we're in trouble. Right? We should just declare all of this an experiment that failed. What do you think? And from this day forward, we are living in a post-racist, post-patriarchal, post-monotheistic age. Why not? And acting on that. And I think that helps us to raise our sights. You know, not just to be content with the small things. Take the simple example, which you've already heard, of equal pay. A very noble cause, but of course it doesn't yet exist. And it's especially startling, I think, in this state where women in general have more education than men in general, but the pay gap still endures. That's not always true in other areas of the country. It's especially difficult here when your average cost of childcare in North Carolina is higher than the national average, when the average amount of money you spend for shelter, for rent, for a place to live is also higher than the national average. So no wonder it's likely that single mothers are going to be the poorest group among us, because not of who they are, but because they have the least support. Every other advanced democracy in the world has a national system of childcare. Some national system which accounts for the fact that children are not born when they're 7 or 8. No, they need care, and they need to see each other and have a community as soon as they are born. We also have the most obsessive work pattern in the world. The Japanese used to defeat us for #1 in obsessive work. No more. We are now #1. So we're becoming less adapted to child rearing, to having a life outside of our work life, even than we were before. And this is true, of course, for men as well as women. So yes, we need to continue in our workplaces to establish childcare. We need to continue in our state legislatures and at the congressional level. You know, not since Nixon have we had a comprehensive child care bill. He vetoed it. We passed it. He vetoed it. We could go back and continue that again. But in a deep sense also, we need to remember that men can be and should be and must be part of child rearing. That is part of the solution as well. Yes, we know now that women can do what men can do. I think we've proved that to most of the country, don't you? But we haven't proved that men can do what women can do. And that means that many, perhaps most women, have 2 jobs. But just as seriously, it means that children grow up without knowing that men can be as loving and nurturing as parents as women can. They grow up with those masculine and feminine gender roles, and so they repeat them. Whether or not it is a parent or a relative or a young male babysitter or an uncle or whoever, we need to let our children see and know men who are loving and nurturing so they know that that's possible. Otherwise, boys grow up to think they must be distant or in control or not close to children, whatever they have seen. We do what we see, not what we're told. And girls grow up to think that distant, unattached men are the norm, and to repeat the problem over again. It is so crucial, that however we can do it, we not only fight the economic and political battle for childcare, but we fight the personal and intimate battle that allows men to be as loving and nurturing as their natures truly are. I said at the beginning that we are half of everything as females, but it's not true anymore. For the first time that I'm aware of, females are no longer half the human race globally. There is so much violence against females, whether it is sexualized violence in war zones or bias towards male children that has created a son surplus and a daughter deficit, or whether it is the various forms of honor killing and all the forms of killing we know and we read about, or whether it is the domestic violence that is our major form of it in this country. If you added up everybody who was killed in 9/11, and then you added all the Americans killed in Iraq and in Afghanistan, then you looked at the numbers of American women murdered by their husbands or boyfriends and added them all up, the number of women killed by their husbands or boyfriends since 9/11 far surpasses the total of those two wars and 9/11. And look at all that all the energy that we put into anti-terrorism. But what about domestic terrorism in the home? What about everything we know that happens not only to the women who are physically damaged, but the children who are watching? All that we know about who is in prison, who is poor, who is, that this disempowerment of women and dehumanization of boys who are made to feel that they too must be dominant and violent is deep, very, very, very deep. To uproot that is our task, and something that each of us in this room can do. And it's crucial because not only is it crucial to save our lives and to create kindness and empathy. Empathy is actually a human response that without which the species wouldn't have survived. If there weren't a natural leap of empathy to another member of your species in trouble, we would not have survived or adapted all these years. But unfortunately, these hierarchical systems and violent systems have evolved ways of breaking that bond of empathy so that you can endure watching or even participating in the punishment or the bullying or whatever form it takes of another human being. It doesn't need to be that way. It has every impact on us, but it also has every impact on democracy. The family is the microcosm of democracy. You can't really have a democracy outside the family if you don't have one inside. You can heal, you can cure, you can change. We all can change. We always can change. But it is a much, much longer road from a violent or hierarchical family to an understanding of empathy, kindness, and democracy as normal elsewhere. There is a book I commend to you called Sex and World Peace by Valerie Hudson and 3 other authors. It's a very respectable scholarly book, but it's also readable. There's not one deconstruct in the whole book, I don't think. I'm always threatening to put a big sign on the road to Harvard and Yale, beware, deconstruction ahead. And by looking at 100 current countries, they demonstrate that the biggest determinant of whether a country is violent within itself, in its streets, or whether a country will be willing to use military violence against another country, is actually not poverty, it's not natural resources, it's not religion, it's not even degree of democracy, it's violence against females. Not because our lives are any more important than male lives, they are not, but because that is the most normalized and frequent kind of violence that then normalizes everything else. If you see it in your household, you come to believe it's necessary. And you can see the extreme of that in the background of terrorists, of the senseless murderers, that we see, people who go into schools and offices, and murders that are committed for no economic gain whatsoever, which is true also of domestic murders. No economic gain. It is totally about expressing control and superiority. I think of them as supremacy crimes, actually, because that is their goal. And those crimes are 99% committed by men, by white men who are not poor. Now, we don't read this in our newspapers, do we? I mean, we see when there are murders in schools or in the movie theater, we see what's happening to our children. Excuse me, it is not our children. If those murderers were African American or Puerto Rican or female, we would know it, right? So why don't we know that they are white, non-poor males, the exact group that is most likely to be raised, to be, through no fault of theirs, raised with the idea that in order to be men, they have to dominate. And so they become addicted to this like a drug, even to the degree of murdering others and then murdering themselves. We have to look at the false gender roles and their exaggeration to understand how we can become human beings again. So I don't know how to break this to you. I'm looking at the time here to see. But I think that if you continue your work and we all continue and keep going for at least a century. No, I'm not kidding, because we're already 40 years into it, I figure, if that's any comfort. Because if you think about the suffragist and abolitionist wave, it took 100 years for women of all races and men of color to be considered human beings rather than chattel. So if it took 100 years to get to be human beings, to get legal identity, it's not so surprising that it may take 100 years to get legal equality and social equality. So, don't listen to people who say we're in a post-feminist, post-racist age. No, that's just the current form of the opposition. First they tell you you can't do it, and then they say, well, you don't need to do it anymore because it's over. It's just the current form. But I think that if we truly look at the possibilities, if we look at the cultures that once existed, if we look at the impulse in us towards kindness and empathy, if we understand that the straight line and the pyramid doesn't exist in nature, only the circle does. It's the only natural form. If we understand that the end doesn't justify the means are the ends. The means become the ends. If we want to have kindness and justice and poetry and music and sex, at the end of the revolution, we have to have kindness and justice and poetry and music and sex along the way. It is absolutely, absolutely crucial. Change is organic. And you in this room are the heart and soul of this change. Just by your being, you are making change. Every time a woman passes a mirror and criticizes her body, a girl is watching. And every time you don't do that and are proud of your strength and your health, a girl is watching. Every time a mother is rebellious and doesn't believe she has to separate herself from her son at a certain time to make him a man, which actually is a homophobic belief anyway, but also just makes the boy feel abandoned by the person he's probably closest to, and he may never trust another woman. I mean, you know, whatever it is that we do, that you in this room do, as activists, as parents, as neighbors, if you make everything you do reflect the goals we want in the end, then we will get where we want to be. Do what you love. Do what you forget what time it is when you're doing it because you love so much. You would do it even if you didn't get paid, though I want all of you to get paid. If you do that, you will find yourself able to do all kinds of things you never thought you could. I, for instance, was way past 30. I was about 35, I think, before I spoke in public. I devoted all of those years to not speaking in public. But because there's something I care about so much, I find myself doing what I didn't know I could do. And I think each of us finds that. Do what you love. Follow your instinct. You know, we have very finely drawn, it's like having a computer that's our instinct, and then sometimes we feel we have to prove it by long division. So just remember, if it walks like a duck, and looks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, and you think it's a pig, it's a pig. Treat ourselves, you know, depending on where we are in the hierarchy, balance may take different forms. For those of us who are not accustomed to being in authority, it may take the form of talking as much as we listen. For those of us who are in authority, it may take the form of listening as much as we talk. But the whole idea is to balance. And if we do these small things, they will all add up to very big things, because change does indeed grow from the bottom, like a tree. Your women-to-women funding is proof that this kind of change is the most effective. Distant money is certainly welcome, but it sometimes doesn't know what it's doing. You here understand what needs support and what has energy and just are plants that need a little watering. If you, as a symbol of a tree, of the roots of a tree, keep growing, then there will be a huge, huge tree in the future that came from the seeds in this room. And it will have happened, not because you sacrificed yourselves, but because you lived the life you want to see in the future.